Well, Kevin, thank you for being with us on the Good on Wood podcast. Just a deep pleasure to have you with us. I remember, just to start, about 20 years ago, I was I was in Panama working with a justice-based organization there. And we were working with indigenous communities in the Panamanian jungle, far outside of city context. And I remember the only spaces that we could kind of inhabit as we were spending weeks out there working with different indigenous communities on land-based issues, whereas these small little churches around. And I remember walking into these churches in the middle of the Panamanian jungle, far away from everything, and there were these huge icons on the wall. And there were these icons with helicopters and bullets and this picture of Oscar Romero. And for me, this is one of my first encounters with Saint Oscar Romero, of trying to come to terms with, we are so far away. We're in these isolated communities, and this person, Oscar Romero, um, has a deep, meaningful place in the lives of these base communities out in the middle of nowhere. And so as we step into this conversation today around the life of Saint Romero, we often like to welcome our guests to start us out by bringing a quote that we can meditate on, that can help frame the conversation. And so as we step into that, Kevin, I'd love it if you could start us with a quote as a means for us to enter into Romero's life and witness.
Well, the wonderful thing about Oscar Romero is he was extraordinarily quotable. If you spend any time on the internet, you will find hundreds and hundreds of really powerful quotes. So it's when you asked me to come up with a quote, it was a kind of a challenge because there are so many to choose from and so many that are so evocative and so powerful. And the other part of it was he was recorded every week. His homilies at the Metropolitan Cathedral in San Salvador were broadcast live when the transmitter wasn't getting blown up by the army.
Yeah.
And so it's all out there. The Romero Trust, a UK website, has hundreds of his homilies translated into English. In fact, the quote I'm using comes from one of those homilies from September 25th, 1977, I believe. And if you want to spend a very fruitful afternoon, I would recommend just ruminating over some of those homilies. They capture in real time the drama, the terror, the oppression, and the suffering, and the the eventual triumph of the people during Romero's days, which were very short. I mean, he was only archbishop for a few years before he was assassinated. So he had a very compressed experience leading the Archdiocese of San Salvador. It's almost like reading the newspapers, and I think in effect that's what his homilies were like for a lot of people, because he would start each of them with, "Here's what happened this week," and here's what happened in this country, here in the city, in the church. And I think that was because most newspapers were so slanted, and most people couldn't get newspapers out in the countryside, but they could get to a radio. So he was sort of not just the spiritual leader of El Salvador, he was sort of the newsman, and that harkens back to his seminary experience with the Claretians, I think, who were always involved in reporting and communication. Anyhow, so this is from one of his homilies. And I don't know, why do I choose this one? It's because it was sort of his mantra, with all that was happening, all the political craziness, all the accusations. To him, being a Christian at that time came down to one thing, and that was love, and maintaining your focus on love, no matter what the turmoil was around you or how you were being calumnized from either side for not being revolutionary enough or being too cozy with the upper class. In his homily from September of 1977, he said, "Let us not tire of preaching love. It is the force that will overcome the world. Let us not tire of preaching love, though we see that waves of violence succeed in drowning the fire of Christian love. Love must win out. It is the only thing that can."
Amen,
So
amen.
Beautiful.
what does he mean by love must win out? It's the only thing that can. I think we see that all the time, right? We have political victories, or we have what he called the peace of the cemetery. But is it a true victory? Is it true peace? If it's not based on love, if it's not based on mercy, if it's based on my side won and your side is vanquished. So now we have a kind of peace, but is it really the kind of peace as God would hope for peace in this world, or the peace that Romero was pursuing so doggedly. He was being attacked from all sides, from the people who were leaning towards a Marxist revolution to the people who were trying to maintain the status quo in El Salvador. He was never performing satisfactory to either side.
Mm.
His main focus was on love and achieving justice and true peace, and not just for the peasants, the campesinos, but also for the wealthy. He was as worried about saving them from themselves as he was about saving the poor from their material poverty. He was worried a lot about what was going to happen to the wealthy when their time came. And he saw that as his job to materially respond to the needs of the poor, but also to save the wealthy, the elite class, who were so indifferent to what was happening
Mhm.
from the divine justice that perhaps would be waiting for them.
Kevin, part of the reason we were so keen to talk to you is because of your book on Romero. And for those of us for whom Romero is so dear, you've heard a little bit about Steve's initial introduction. Romero, for me, in my early 20s and the early 2000s, I lived in Romero House in a hybrid Peace Church Catholic worker that we started in one of the roughest neighborhoods of my city. My youngest, his middle name is Oscar, after Oscar Romero. For those of us who feel like he is present with us, it can sometimes be difficult to sum up his story, to kind of allow people a little sketch that is an introduction. When you find yourself, whether it be at dinner parties or people asking about what you've written about previously, how do you introduce people to the content and the context of Romero's life?
Oh boy. Sad to say, in the part of northern Westchester that I inhabit, Oscar Romero's name does not come up that often at dinner parties. But now I feel ashamed that I haven't surfaced it myself. It's funny. My oldest boy, I wanted to call him Oscar Romero Clarke, and my
Wow.
wife kiboshed that. She thought Oscar was a little, perhaps the wrong ethnicity for my Irish-faced son. So we compromised, and his name is Owen Romero Clarke. So we
Right.
chose
You know, Oscar is also an Irish name,
yeah,
but you
what?
didn't win. Yeah.
I didn't win. Sometimes you got to take your L's
That's right.
and move on. But yeah, I think I don't know. I was never a very good salesman of my own material, so I was never pushing my book on people. But I think people know when they visit the Clarks that we're a Catholic household, and I don't like to get in anyone's face about beliefs. But if they ask and they're legitimately curious, we are happy to go on, particularly about the story of Oscar Romero, because it's such a powerful one and it's so moving. I get a lot of, I didn't know that. I never heard of that guy, especially outside of Catholic circles. But
Do you think people are familiar with the political context,
No.
particularly after him being sainted, right? Would you sketch a little bit so he just doesn't stay on people's walls or in the names of our children? Would you put him on the soil of El Salvador at that moment and what it was like at the time?
Well, he might have been the perfect person for that role at that time when he became Bishop of San Salvador in, I want to say, was it 77?
Yeah, 77.
Because he had connections with the upper class. He had strong connections with the upper class. He had been bishop of another diocese. He had never lost those. Those people thought of him as one of theirs, right? The upper class, the wealthy, the business people, the plantation owners, the hacienda owners. At the same time, he was connecting with the impoverished people of El Salvador and becoming intimate with their suffering and the challenges they were facing. Initially he was considered a safe choice for leading El Salvador because there was already so much turmoil when he became archbishop. He could talk to anyone, In fact, it's tragic that he was assassinated because he might have been the last best hope for avoiding a civil war in El Salvador, which after his murder, it was bad. It was already bad, but it got a million times worse after his death. And maybe that was the last chance U.S. officials who were scheming on the sidelines, Salvadorans who were trying to avoid civil war, he might have represented the last chance to prevent that.
Mm.
He grew up in a poor community. His family was not as poor as many of his neighbors, but they were far from wealthy. I think his father was a merchant and sort of ran the mail delivery service for the community. And probably also, everyone had their own little farm for subsistence. So he did all of that work as a child, worked on the harvest. He delivered mail to the community, literally delivered bad news when it came from afar. So people talk about his conversion when he became archbishop. That didn't sit properly with me because it seemed to me, how could he not have understood what it meant to be poor in El Salvador. He grew up among poor people. He was poor himself. He got direct experience delivering news to people. He was sending messages of suffering and of course, happiness too and joy, but also messages of even more suffering to the people in his community. So I feel like
Mm.
since his childhood, he has been intimately connected with the struggles of everyday life and particularly the unique economic and socio-political structure that caused so much suffering in El Salvador.
Also, there's this moment he decides he wants to be a priest, I think at like 14. He goes to junior seminary, and then
Yeah,
there's this
and that was
moment
with
where
the
his mo
Claretians.
yeah, where his mother gets very ill and he has to step out for like 3 or 4 months, and he works in a gold mine in
Yeah.
Potosi for a while. So again, that's one of these kinda, I think, early moments where
Yeah,
he's
if you're
deeply
working in a gold
invested.
mine, you're
Yeah,
understanding very
your
viscerally what it's like
connections,
to
yeah.
be poor. Yeah,
Yeah.
what it's like to be a
Mm,
laborer.
And yet, as the story's often told, and famously in the American film, that it was the death of his friend who was a priest and a father and a young boy who were also assassinated with him, where these experiences that you've both just mapped seem to culminate into something else. Is that this telling that you think might make a good story but doesn't quite do justice to the contours of his previous life?
I think that's very fair to put it that way. Does a lot change after Rutilio Grande is assassinated? He was a dear friend of Oscar Romero's. He was perhaps his only strong friendship among the Jesuits. He had burned a lot of bridges there over the years with the Jesuits and the Passionists because of his criticism of them when he was Bishop of Santiago de Maria and as an auxiliary bishop in San Salvador. So that hit him very hard to lose that friend. In fact, I think Grande was the master of ceremonies for his elevation as bishop. So that's how close they were. So it certainly is true that he steps up dramatically after that. But I see that more as him rising to the times, understanding that the times he was in demanded so much more. So it looks like a sharp turn, but I think it's just his wisdom in assessing the situation and saying, I have to do more. I can't do the usual here. I can't get up and just sermonize and hope that the rich can be converted through words. I have to start taking actions. He referred to it often as an evolution.
Hmm.
He was
mm,
evolving along with it. I mean, if you track his life, he really kind of dovetails quite nicely with some of the earthquakes, the changes that Vatican II was creating in the church in terms of how we thought of ourselves as church, how we acted in history, right? How we acted in
mhm,
society. And he resisted that a lot early on as a priest and as an auxiliary bishop. He was very uncomfortable with he didn't like the priests not wearing cassocks. He thought that was, I think he wrote several editorials attacking the Jesuits for like wearing jeans or what have you. That was one of his pet peeves, was complaining
mm,
about clerical attire, which is how he got sort of reputation for being conservative and a bit of a scold. He was very
yeah,
scrupulous to the point of perhaps his own detriment. But
yeah,
he always talked about his life as an evolution. He studied the documents of Vatican II. He studied Medellin. He studied Puebla. He took these documents very seriously. Even if initially he was kind of afraid or terrified of their implications, he took them
Hmm.
seriously and he prayed over them. He read them. He discerned, a very good Jesuit word there. He had
Mm.
Jesuit training. He had taken the Jesuit spiritual training. So he was open, to talk about a conversion. I think it's, yes, there were dramatic changes after Grande's assassination, but he was also in a process for years before that, a process of change
yeah,
himself, along with the church, understanding what the preferential option for the poor meant, right? The
Mm.
great statement, I believe, that came out of Medellin. So what did that mean in practical terms? For him, it meant not just raising up the needs and the concerns of the poor and making that a primary focus of the church, but listening to the poor,
Yeah.
right? He
mm,
he started going to Bible study with people from Santiago de Maria, from campesinos, farm workers, people who
Yeah.
the church did not consider sources of wisdom or thoughtfulness. And he found himself stunned by what he was learning about the Bible from these people. So
Yeah.
for him, the
mm,
preferential option for the poor meant more than just addressing material needs or elevating the priority of addressing those material needs. It meant involving the poor, listening to the poor, and humbly accepting wisdom from the poor as well. And he did
mm.
that. He did that quite a lot. He always made that a practice. He grew up deeply poor in a deeply poor community. And in the church in San Salvador, I think he was church secretary. He spent years and years doing that. And it just sort of isolated him from the daily life of the average person, whether working poor in the city or campesino in the countryside. So when he got back, when he was reassigned as the leader of the Diocese of Santiago de Maria, it restored that experience. And all those childhood memories came flooding back. He likened it to charcoal being blown upon and the flame reigniting, right? Because it was
Mm,
all there. It was all in his background. It
yeah.
was all in his memory. It was in his bones, right? So to
Oh,
come back and see that so little had changed, right? The same
Mm.
syndromes, the same phenomenons, the same cycles of immiseration that he experienced as a child. He was watching it all play out all over again with very little difference in terms of the material life of the poor and the treatment of them, their human dignity being trodden upon. He saw the laborers coming in from the countryside to work on the coffee plantations, literally paid so poorly they slept on the streets. There was no place for them to even shelter under. So that was one of the first things he
Mhm.
did, was create a place where the laborers could have a roof over their heads while they were working the fields. And
mm,
then it was not far from like seeing that physical manifestation of the structural injustice of Salvador for him to say, this has to change. And
yeah.
that was years before Ortilio Grande. He was
Yeah.
already
Yeah.
talking about the structures have to change. The way he saw it happening, though, was conversion. Like, we'll convert the rich, and then they'll respond and do their Christian duty to their brothers and sisters who are materially poorer than them, but they're equals, right, under God,
Mm.
in God's eyes.
Yeah.
And that was the part that perhaps changed, where he thought, no, I have to do more than just preach to these people. I have to take
Yeah.
Mm.
what many are going to say, these are political gestures. You're getting involved in politics.
Before we kind of hone in to those 3 years post him becoming Archbishop, I still think it would be great for us, in light of the fact that we have a real global listenership, to hone in a little more on the nature of what is happening in El Salvador in the 1970s in particular. This kind of
Mhm.
increase in violence, especially the government under the leadership of the other Romero, right, of Carlos Huberto Romero, and the onslaught and beginning of death squads, and the ways in which American imperial regime is invested in that process, right? And, the School of Americas, Contra Wars swirling around.
Well, I mean, yes, there are new things happening. There is American imperialism. There is worry over communism. There's Cuba. There's Nicaragua, the revolution, Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, that sort of propelled the American interest in El Salvador. But ultimately, to me, to my eyes, we're seeing something ancient here as well. I mean, people displaced from their land. The colonial structure under the Spanish was very little changed. The names might have
Mhm.
changed at the top of the heap. There were different families in charge, landowners, different commodities, right? Coffee had been
Mm.
introduced, I think, in the early 19th century as a cash crop, but the same syndrome of exploitation and indifference that predated American involvement by centuries was what
Mhm.
really what was at work in the 1960s and 70s in El Salvador. What I guess had changed was, the church was teaching people to read. The church was
Yeah.
teaching people to read the Bible and study the Bible and talk about liberation. And which is why the church became targeted, because it was not seen as a charitable outreach. It was perceived as a revolutionary gesture,
Yeah.
aligning with the Marxists who were rising in the countryside. I'm not sure what the literacy rate was in that time, but I'm confident it was fairly low. And the
Mm.
church, one of the things that were targeted were the church's literacy programs, right? Because
Yeah.
you teach
Mhm,
people to
mhm.
read, they can study their own circumstances a little better. I mean, they certainly knew how they were being exploited. They understood what exploitation was and injustice. But, to put it in a historical context, you have to be able to read, right? You have to be able to read books. And then to put it in a gospel context, you have to be able to read the Bible. So that was a revolutionary act. What the church was doing is teaching people to read and teaching them to read the Bible and draw their own lessons and wisdom from the Bible. So yes, Americans were very worried about El Salvador being the next Nicaragua. The
Mhm.
Sandinistas had driven out Somoza. And, if I could, can I digress here real quickly? Because I think this is
Please.
where
Yeah,
the
yeah.
original, his quote comes in. It's so powerful. Like, love must win out. It's the only thing that can. How many of us were so excited by the Sandinista revolution? Oh, we thought
Mm,
that's going to fix all the injustice in Nicaragua. And here we are, 40 years later, and Ortega is the new Somoza. And in fact, in many ways, he's worse than Somoza. and he's persecuting everyone. And, some of the hard right, he's persecuting the church most thoroughly because he's most worried it's the last institution standing. So love did
Mm.
not win out there, right? Politics won out, a mode of thinking about how to organize society and economy, and the political structure of Nicaragua won out, but love did not. And, now we're still waiting. We're still waiting for justice. We're still waiting for peace.
Mm.
And, and that's, I hate to say the same thing could be said of El Salvador too right now. I mean, we have peace, but it's the peace of the cemetery. It's the
Yeah.
peace of 70,000, 80,000 people locked up in jails. How many men between the ages of 15 and 30 are left to walk the streets of San Salvador? Not many. A lot of them are in jail. It has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Now, I know average Salvadorans are gratified that the gang violence has been brought under control, but this is, again, the peace of the cemetery. It removed the problem by removing the people. We can hope that in the end, justice and civic order will be restored. But this, again, is Romero's wisdom. This was not a victory
Mhm.
based in love. It was a victory based on power and expediency.
Mm.
So is that really peace? Not if you're a family member of those men who've been locked up and have no recourse right now. So, getting back to the context of El Salvador in the 70s, yeah, you had the same rigid system of exploitation that the Spanish had created. The indigenous communities, by now mostly mestizo communities, had been removed from their best land, from arable land. They were basically, left with the cruddiest land to try and subsist on. And then everyone sort of was free, as it were, to become laborers at harvest time, which is what the landowning class really needed. They needed a vast army at harvest that they didn't have to take care of after that. So that's why the poverty continued and persisted. And, by the 60s, it was reaching a crisis point. And there had been examples in Cuba and Nicaragua of successful Marxist resistance movements. So that was the foment that Romero faced when he became Archbishop of San Salvador. The government was run by, I don't even think there was a civilian left running the junta at the time. I think the civilians had all resigned in protest because basically the military was running the government and had been for decades, since the 30s, I believe. The last time a vast massacre took place of the peasant community of the campesinos, 1932, I believe, something like 30 or 40,000 people were killed after a small uprising, terrified the elite of Salvador. So the National Guard went on a rampage that lasted over a month, I believe. And by the end of it, thousands of people had been murdered who had nothing to do with the uprising that triggered that terror.
Yeah.
That was sort of a formative experience in that the upper class, the landowners, business elite were always in the back of their mind wondering when the next uprising might take place, when a revenge for that massacre might be coming, a retribution for that massacre might be coming. Historically, they inverted the victims there, right? There was a small number of landowners that were killed by the initial campesino uprising. By the end of the massacre, the people who massacred were all peasants, were all campesinos, indigenous people, and mestizo communities. But in the historical memory of Salvador, it was, we have to keep those people down because they'll massacre us. So they kind of obliterated their role in actually committing the massacre and inverted the history. And the lesson for them was we have to be ruthless with these people. And they surely were. The death squads were beginning their dirty business when Romero became bishop. The Americans, their role clearly was powerful as well. They were arming the army. They were sending money and military supplies, terrified. Jimmy Carter was terrified that he would be blamed for another Central American country falling to communism.
Yeah.
He had already lost Nicaragua. Remember he was running for re-election. So that all played into what was happening. So they were looking for any way to rationalize sending more weapons to support the Salvadoran military. And of course, Romero was a problem there as well. In fact, one of his last acts was to write a letter to Jimmy Carter and say, do not send this military aid package. They will use it to kill their own people. They'll use it to oppress their own people. He stripped away whatever veneer of geopolitical necessity that Carter was trying to put on it. Carter, who's beloved for his human rights, focus here in the United States. But at that time,
in terms of American presidents who approximate the Beatitudes, Carter is certainly at the top of the list. And yet, these realities put into context, I guess, the rest, right? Like, this is a
Yeah.
part of the history that doesn't often get highlighted. Would you now take us to what built over those last few years, those 3 years of ministry, and those last weeks of his life, and the way that he was crucified at the Mass? Would you invite us into that reality?
Well, when he became bishop, things were already pretty ugly, but they got much uglier, and it was clearly accelerating. The death squads were becoming more active. People were being killed greatly indiscriminately. If you were a teacher, you said something that for whatever reason was taken the wrong way, you could end up in an alleyway the next night. And people close to him were being killed. Catechists that he knew and
Mm.
had worked with were being killed. And this was part of what he did when he did they broadcast his homilies from the cathedral. It was sort of like, here's who was killed this week.
Yeah.
Oh, I knew this person. I knew that person. And he also tried to minister to the upper class because, as at the same time, the army, the white warriors and other death squads were operating clandestinely at night, killing people horribly in many with, torturing and killing people. There were agents on the left who were also seeking retribution and committing their own, not to the scale. I think the Truth Commission found that something like 95% of the atrocities were committed by the military or death squads that were operating at the direction of the military. But there were some, and he said mass for a government leader who was murdered by the left. And the next day, that night, a death squad attacked a Catholic retreat house and killed a priest and 3 or 4 of the retreatants. And he said mass for them the next day. So that was the kind of,
Mm.
experience he was having, where he would have to bury a right-wing figure and then bury left-wing, describe those left-wing figures. They were Catholics doing what Catholics normally
Being
do,
faithful.
run a
Yeah.
retreat house. But that was enough of a threat that the death squad attacked them. And I don't even think that one was not a death squad. I think it was a straight-on military attack. And then
Wow.
they tried to say later that the retreatants had attacked them from the roof. They put the bodies on the roof and put guns in their hands and created this tableau of violence. So that was his weekly reality. He was constantly under threat. The right-wing media, controlled by the landowners and the business elite, hated Romero. They were essentially calling for either his removal or his death, his assassination. He had a bomb placed at the altar not too long before. He knew it was coming.
Mm.
I think that's pretty clear. He was under no, illusion about what was happening and what his likely fate was going to be. He prayed about it a lot. He was fearful, about how he would handle it. He was, like any of us, he was afraid of would it be painful? Would it be crippled? Imagine yourself in that situation and trying to think about the way they were killing people then. It was bomb explosions, torture, and then bullet to the head. Not exactly how most of us imagine ourselves going. So
Yeah.
he was afraid, but he was not fearful, if I would put it that way.
Yeah. Wow.
He suffered physical fear, but it did not prevent him from seeing what his duty was and pursuing it. And that's the
Mm.
amazing thing. And towards the end, he was mostly worried about people being hurt around him when his time came. Because he thought if there's a bomb, he wouldn't even use a driver because he didn't want to have a driver get shot in his
Wow.
assassination.
Yeah.
Wow.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, he had no misunderstandings about where this was all heading. He kind of knew the target was on his person, and there was kind of no avoiding that fate. And his decision then was like, how do I, it's not to say he was suicidal or anything. He loved life. He loved his community. He loved being bishop, but he was stoic enough to understand this can only end in one place. And he'd already seen it. Rutilio, he saw his body. He saw the bullet wounds in Rutilio Grande's body. He saw 5 other priests murdered while he was their pastor. So he knew where it was heading.
So March 23rd, 1980, he gives this famous sermon,
Stop the repression.
Stop the Repression. To read his words here, he says, "In the name of God and in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I beg you, no, I implore you, I order you, in the name
Yeah.
of God, stop the repression."
And there he was speaking directly to the campesinos who had been conscripted into the Salvadoran army. Conscripted is a very nice word.
Sure.
A lot of these guys were grabbed off the streets and thrown into the army. That's how conscription happened. They needed bodies, they needed soldiers, and I'm sure there was some degree of indoctrination that took place to get these guys to pull the trigger on their own people. But Romero understood he could still reach these guys. They're murdering their own fellow campesinos, sometimes even people from their own communities. And he didn't speak to the officers. He didn't speak to the officer corps. He spoke directly to those soldiers and said, much as, Archbishop Broglio here in the United States not too long ago said to American servicemen who are service members in the Caribbean, reminding them they can make a conscious claim against illegal orders, right? Blowing up
Mm.
speedboats in the Caribbean. And that, to me, was a very dramatic reverberation, an echo of what Romero said, that soldiers should not be put in position of following criminal orders. Romero was speaking directly to the soldiers and reminding them that, you serve God before you serve man, and God's law should have primacy in your heart and your mind. This, to the upper class and to the military, is the most egregious treason, right? What Romero said, that was it. When they heard that, it was basically, someone rid me of this troublesome priest, right? He's got to go. The next day, he was saying mass, a requiem mass, a memorial mass for a family friend's matriarch. It was published in the local newspaper that Oscar Romero would be saying this mass, and that was all the information and all the cue that the death squad leaders needed. They saw it as sort of, oh, God is telling us where he's going to be tomorrow. And one of the leaders of the assassination was Avila. The names of the people in the mass were also Avila. So the name Avila appeared repeatedly in this mass notice. He took that as a sign from God that it was time for him to act and put an end to Romero.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah, that's chilling.
Yeah, they had their own sort of mystical beliefs, satanic mystical beliefs, you would have to say in retrospect.
Yeah.
But God was on their side, right? God wanted us, God wills it, that we get rid of this priest who's causing the campesinos to rise up and threaten the upper class, like the 1932 uprising.
I think it's worth saying as well, thousands of people attended Romero's funeral, and at the funeral procession, right? During his funeral, the army fired upon the crowd, killing more than 30 people, wounding hundreds who were at Romero's funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And for a lot of Americans,
Mm-hmm.
that was the first time that they understood what was happening in Salvador.
Wow.
Because that funeral got a lot of coverage in the American press. And I was a freshman in college, right? I gotta think back there. And I remember being gobsmacked. Wait, somebody killed a Catholic bishop? I'd never heard of it. I couldn't believe such a phenomenon could occur. And I remember thinking, aren't those soldiers Catholics? How could they kill? And that's sort of my first awareness of what Salvador was, what was happening there. So when that attack on the funeral mass took place, a lot of American Catholics suddenly were aware of what Salvador was because Romero had been killed. And now they're seeing his funeral mass turns into a massacre. And that's when questions started being asked. What are we doing here? Why are we involved in this country? What's our role? Why are we contributing to maintaining this chaos? And then, of course, 7 months later, 4 American churchwomen were murdered by the same military that killed Romero.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all in 1980, and the war continued until 1992.
Yeah.
So that's the real heartache. There'd be so much more suffering ahead of everybody in Salvador.
As you're talking about Romero's life and witness, especially these last 3 years where he's trying to shepherd this community into a very dangerous, powerful witness in the midst of so much suffering, I want to ask about Romero's spirituality, the frames that prayer and the avenues of his interior life, which I think comes seeping out. You talked about his homilies earlier.
That's right.
And all of his writings, and that work that he embodied and boldly stepped into, I think requires some very profound depth. And so I wonder if you can invite us into some of the interior life of Oscar Romero.
Oh boy. This is where my hypocrisy really shines in moments like this, where I'm invited to comment on somebody else's interior life or their spiritual life when mine is so thin myself. The thing about Romero, he took the church very seriously. He took the church's teaching very seriously. He studied it. He read it. He thought about it, meditated on it, and prayed on it. And I'm as bad as probably most Catholics about that. I skim the encyclicals. If I, completely honest, I skim the encyclicals. Kind of hard to trudge through the documents of Vatican II. But he did. Like, Romero's like, well, partly, in our defense, it was his job. He was a bishop.
That's right.
So, and he didn't have 4 kids, right, to chase around all day. So he had some time to study, but he did study them. He took them very seriously. So I think if that could be described as a kind of spirituality, he was responsible to his obligation to think about, to study. How many priests, like they've already got preconceived notions about what a document's going to be. So I don't want to read that. That's leftist drivel or whatever the heck. And he was a conservative person, and was somewhat skeptical of these documents, but he realized it's my obligation as a Christian to at least understand what the discussion is about, right? So he read the documents, he's thought about them, and it didn't change immediately, but eventually they did change him. They did change his perspective, just as the church's perspective didn't change immediately after Medellin or after the Vatican II documents were published, or Puebla. We're still exploring it, experiencing the reverberations from those publications, right? So Romero changed gradually based on his reading as he learned more, and his discernment, right? That's a great Jesuit word, discernment. He was trained by the Jesuits. He understood what discernment meant. He devoted the time to it. The other thing he devoted time to was prayer. And this is where I really fail, spiritually speaking. He took prayer very seriously. And no matter how tired he was, no matter how crazy the day was or how exhausting or how much trauma it was filled with, he found time to pray every night, even if it's like 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. It was a super long day. That to him was sustenance. That was blood. And how many of us really do that, where we engage in not meditative prayer, but like transactional prayer? Like Romero was just praying for give me the wisdom, show me the way, right? How can I be the best bishop, the most effective preacher, the most effective leader, especially in these really troubled, difficult times? And I don't know, in terms of how to talk about his spirituality or his theology, he was not a liberation theologian.
Yeah.
I don't think he was really a theologian at all. He was, a bureaucrat for most of his career. But he did understand what he didn't understand. So he was willing to listen to other people and other wiser theologians, and eventually to the poor became his strongest guides. So he was open.
Yes.
He was humble. Yeah. He was prayerfully open and ready and willing to change and adapt. And he understood that, spirituality without action, theology without action was useless. The kingdom is here. Yes, the kingdom, we're waiting on the eternal kingdom, but the kingdom is also here. He didn't recognize a duality or a very, separated duality between the kingdom of God, the eternal life, and the kingdom of God that we're all experiencing now. This is all God. This is the kingdom. It's our obligation to do what we can to bring the kingdom, to create the kingdom. And he took that very seriously as well. He didn't want to be, and this is where, you can be, he was so political. And we hear it now. We hear it all the time now. The bishops should stay in their lane. The bishops don't understand economics. The bishops don't understand politics. They should stick to church stuff. Well, what do we mean by that? Like lighting candles and praying rosaries? Is that church stuff? And the rest is we shouldn't participate in, or we're not called to be participants in our own lives and our own futures.
Yeah.
And in creation, in this historical reality that we inhabit. He rejected that. I don't know if you'd call that theology or spirituality, but
absolutely,
it was a practical spirituality, a practical theology that helped him, do the work he needed to do.
And Kevin, your answer so perfectly feeds into what sometimes seems like such a cold question after we talk about, interior life and spirituality. And then we like to ask about like the theory of change. And theory of change sounds so dry, so abstract, the kind of stuff that community organizers talk about, but might not be as nearly a lived reality, like talking about spirituality. But as you just named, it's directly connected in the witness of Romero, that his prayer life and his ability to hear the cries of the poor and allow them, as you've articulated, to become his teachers and his theologians, those who unschooled, barely schooled, but as they open up the Gospels and see the life of Christ and know their own pain and start to articulate it through the life of Christ, it starts to convert him in deeper and deeper ways. You've already shared a little bit that prior to him becoming Archbishop, there was a theory of change around the conversion of the wealthy, the conversion of those who were at the top of the institutions while the masses stayed at the bottom. Would you open up a little bit what the change was in how he thought about change once he became Archbishop?
Well, I think he started realizing that it was not enough to change minds and change hearts. I don't think he ever abandoned his notion from early in his priesthood that there was sort of a divine wisdom in having a small group of people with wealth and abundance and a vast majority of people who had so little that they depended on the charity of the wealthy, right? He saw that in a weird way. Maybe there's a yin and yang thing at work there. Like the rich can help the poor and thus save themselves. That's how he saw that cycle working. Like, what a great gift for them that they have this opportunity to save themselves from their riches. You know, the poor had nothing but God. That was something Romero once said. They were so close to God because they had nothing else to rely on. The government failed them. The economy failed them. Their wealthy patrons failed them. Even the church failed them, right? They had God, and that's how they lived their lives, very close to God. And there's a freedom in that as well that he perceived, right? I don't know. They were intimate with the spiritual and the temporal because they had no other option, right?
Yes.
They were living that line very closely. So when he saw the rich, he felt sorry for them. They had so many distractions. They had so many other ways to buffer their real life from God, from the divine, from the eternal. They had, parties and horse races and whatever the hell else, all these stupid, meaningless things that we do to fill our time. But now we all, the iPhone is a great equalizer for rich and poor alike. We devote ourselves to social media now. But in a sense, Romero saw this as a great equalizer, that maybe it was God's wisdom, that the rich could be saved from themselves by the poor. If you could convert them, if they could come to see their obligation to materially support and nurture. But he realized after a while that this only goes so far. And all this does is recreate the cycle for another generation, right? If all we're doing is transferring wealth through charity, not through justice, or conducting structural change, you start saying scary things like structural analysis. And if you're a Catholic, oh my God, what does that mean? You're a Marxist. Suddenly no longer a Catholic, you're a Marxist because you said structural analysis. Well, he stopped being afraid of that. He saw the wisdom of that. Like, why am I saving people materially in this generation, or trying to, because they really weren't succeeding, because it's very hard to get the rich to pry open their pocketbooks to take care of the poor. Or it's much harder to get them to change the system, that system that had served them so well through hundreds of growing seasons, to get them to say, hey, this isn't right that we have impoverished subsistence farmers picking your coffee beans twice a year and then living in poverty for the rest of the time. We need to address that. He was able to persuade some among the wealthy to that wisdom. He changed their hearts, and they became supporters of the sort of the middle ground there that was trying to avoid the Civil War. But, I guess for him, he became dissatisfied with his own sort of understanding of the cycle of charity and misery, saving everyone. He thought maybe we should, as many Christians in that era came to realize, we have to throw a monkey wrench into this cycle.
Yep.
And, sad to say, here we are 60 years later, and can we say that we have changed those systems? Not in Central America. The same kind of thing is happening. And in my country, I can't say that we've really addressed structural inequities in a meaningful way. Hell, we're still fighting over healthcare.
Oh my goodness.
I never thought when I first became a journalist, wrote about the inequities of the healthcare system, that I'd still be writing about them. It's one of my desolations, really, that I still, everything I wrote about last week, I could have written about 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a downer. I'm sorry. Your poor audience doesn't need to hear me.
Not at all. No, I think most of our audience are so viscerally aware of those realities. It's a comfort to hear somebody else articulate them and go, oh, it's not just me feeling this grief.
Well, history is a terrible, humbling reminder that we always think we're living in the worst of times until, one of those little social media alerts came up the other day about an Irish coffin ship becoming the first coffin ship to land in Canada on January 27th. And just reading about the misery of that experience, and something like 5,000 people were landed dead and buried in Montreal. And I thought, well, I guess things are a little better now. So
Sure.
it put my turmoil into perspective quite a bit. History is a great misery we struggle to awaken from.
Mm,
But Romero awakened to the point where he, if I could say it this way, he wanted to see not just changes of hearts and minds, he wanted to see changes in structures and systems. And that's what made him a very dangerous person. Now, you could say he came to that, it was a Marxist analysis. No, I mean, poor liberation theology gets beaten up all the time for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he just saw it as, in very practical terms, like we have got to stop this system of misery creation, And what's more Christian than that?
Amen.
Amen. Yeah. Well, as we slowly wrap up this conversation, we want to start to think about the world we inhabit now and the contribution of Romero's life and witness as we, sit in his story and sit in the realities of state-sponsored violence, international imperialisms, and authoritarianism, and all these types of things that we obviously can't relate to in any way, shape, or form today.
Yeah, thank
And
God we resolved all that. That's
That's
great
yeah,
to have that
thank goodness.
behind us.
But thinking through again, I mean, you bring this great quote at the beginning to talk about love must win out.
Yeah.
Certainly, we're experiencing deep polarization again, processes of tremendous violence that are everywhere, right? Not just in your neck of the woods, but here and there and everywhere. And I wonder if you could just ruminate a little bit on the lasting contribution of Romero and his witness and what it means for us today and some of the lessons that maybe we can take from his life.
Well, I think, I don't know, primarily courage,
Mm,
I, I, I so respect, I so esteem, I so envy his courage. I don't know if I would ever have that degree of knowing what was coming, knowing that he had opportunities, he had off ramps. He could have shut up, could have stopped sermonizing the way he was sermonizing. He could have stopped writing letters to Jimmy Carter.
yeah.
There was plenty of ways he could have saved himself, but he understood, that he was part of a historical process. He wasn't it. He was a piece of it.
Mm.
Earlier, I said it's so many quotables, but one of them, and I think it was his dying sermon, the sermon as he was killed, he said, what is a grain of wheat if it hasn't died, lands in the ground, and then it grows to something. We are part of something bigger than all of us. We will never see the time of justice and peace, really. Like, we're always going to be living in turmoil, but we can't let that incapacitate us. He did not let his physical fear, legitimate fear, well-founded fear, stop him from acting, stop him from continuing to speak out. These days, I do find myself wondering if I'm on some list in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
if my social media comments, which are not
Yeah.
subtle, are not being tracked somewhere. And that seems like preposterously self-centered. But these days, with the capacity they have in terms of the computer software that they're developing and the biometric scanning and the studying, who the heck knows? And I've often thought, maybe I should not fire off that comment or write that article or get on somebody else's list, right? Tiny, tiny, tiny risks that I'm taking right now in comparison to the great mortal risks that Romero took with his own life, because he was willing to offer it all up, He was willing to make that sacrifice for the kingdom, for the church, for his people. And that, I guess, is that exemplar of courage in the face of so much adversity and terror. I mean, the government was trying to create a state of terror to stop everyone, right? If you live in terror and fear, you are completely immobilized.
Mm.
Yeah.
Now, It was a million times worse than what we're seeing in Minneapolis, but it's the same idea,
Yes.
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Create a state of siege, create a state of terror, masked men roaming the streets.
Hmm.
In El Salvador, they would only do that at night, but they
Yeah.
were masked men roaming the streets and they were killing people. We have it in broad daylight in the United States right
Oof.
now. Like who
Wow.
would believe this
Mm.
could come to pass? Nobody would believe this would be happening, but here it is. These are our times. So you can either, hunker down, lock your door, turn off your TV, if anyone still watches TV, or you can get out there and you can read the gospel and you can pray. You can prayerfully decide what you need to do to face the times you're in. That's what Romero did.
Mm.
I hope I, in a very tiny way, am doing the same thing. None of us can do everything. I just wrote a piece, interviewed some Catholic peacemakers here in the United States about how do we act in this environment? How do we respond? And they all said, no one can do everything. Pray, think about it, do what you can, but don't do
Yeah.
nothing.
Beautiful.
Don't think
Yeah.
you can just stay home and hope that this story, this wave of history passes over you.
Hmm.
There's no one escaping this alive, right?
Yeah.
We're all going to the same place.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
have the courage to be in your times and to form your times as best you can.
Yeah, that's really well put, Kevin. If Saint Romero's contribution is courage, what's his challenge?
To do all that with love still in your heart for everyone, Like you mentioned polarization. There is not
Yeah.
a country in the world more polarized than mine right now. People don't even speak to each other now. Family members don't speak to each other. They're afraid to talk to each other. And a lot of it is it's down to hate. It's down to anger, fury, And somehow Romero to the bitter end kept the focus on love and mercy. He never
Mm.
ceased hoping to convert the people of the elite, the political and economic elite. He never ceased hoping to convert them because he was so concerned about their immortal souls. It was his job to pull them back from their own worst selves. That's a hard thing to do now.
Yeah.
Certain political actors here, we just want to dismiss and just
Yeah.
their lost causes. How many people say, I hate that guy? You say it kind of pedestrian manner. I hate that guy. But after a while, it's not a flippant comment. It's a real thing. You hate that person. And
Yeah.
that's that's when your civil wars can happen. And
Mhm.
Romero constantly kept love and mercy. I tell my kids to lead with mercy all the time. Can't go wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great.
Let it be.
Well, Kevin, the podcast is called Good on Wood because of the Daniel Berrigan quote. If you're going to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. And we're really appreciative of how you've spelt out Oscar Romero's life and witness to help people do just that. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, appreciate
Thank you
it.
for putting up with me this morning or this evening for you guys.